Alright guys, so we're going to start to look at forms and inputs, and we're going to be doing this for this lecture and the next one. Okay, the next one we'll do some of the more fancy stuff. But this is the file called 3_3forms.html. Alright, so I'm going to close that up. And we're going to go down to where it says start here, and we just have a form with some divs, and then inside those divs we have an input and a label. Okay, now Materialize is one of those frameworks where the inputs actually look pretty decent without having to do anything at all to them. There's no materialized classes or anything. It just looks like this by default, with the exception of the text area, which doesn't. But for these, like for instance the text field, there's not really anything we really have to add here as far as classes or anything like that. We have an input with a placeholder, an ID. The label has a for attribute which should match the ID. That's not materialized, it's just standard HTML. It's so that if you click on the label, it'll actually refer to that field. Alright, one thing we do want to do is wrap these divs, or add to the divs, the class of input field, and save, and let's see what that did. So if we go and we look at the input field div, which is right here, let's see what that includes. It makes it relative, it gives it a margin top, so it kind of moves it down a little bit, but that's about it. I think it may be used in JavaScript for something, but I think that's about it. So we just want to make sure that we add that class for all of these divs. So this will be class input field. Now for this example, I want to show you how we can add a value. This is just standard HTML. So let's say we wanted a value of whatever, john@gmail.com. Save, and that'll be filled. And then to disable it, we just want to add a disabled attribute like that, not a class but an attribute, and save, and now we can't edit that. But that's not Materialize. I'm just showing you how it looks in Materialize. Nothing we did here is specific to the framework. Alright, now for the text area, you can see this doesn't look right compared to the rest of these. So what we have to do with text areas is we need to add a class of Materialize text area dash text area. Alright, so once I do that and I save, now you can see the text area looks good. And let's also give the div a class of input field. Alright, now this next one is an inline field, okay? Which it isn't right now, but we're going to make it into an inline field. And we do that by adding to this class, or adding to this div, a class of input field, just like the rest, but we're also going to add the class of inline. Alright, so by doing that, we'll be able to make this inline. And that should be dash field, input dash field, and inline. And there we go. So now you can see it's on the same level as the text, okay, or the label. Actually, it's not a label, it's just the text here. The label is this actual number sign, and you can see it moves up when I click in it, which is pretty cool. In fact, any of these, if we don't have a placeholder, so for instance, let's go to the name and remove the placeholder and save. Now the label is right on the input, and if I click, it moves up. Okay, it moves up and down. So I'll leave that placeholder off just as an example. So that's inline. Let's see, let's go to the icon prefix. So if we want to add a prefix, first of all, let's give it the input field div, and then we're going to go right before it. This is for a telephone number, so I'm going to put an I tag with the class of material icons, and then we're going to use the phone icon. Okay, now that alone looks crappy, so we want to add to this material icons class prefix and save, and now it kind of pushes the input over and it puts it in place. All right, so now what I want to do is look at some validation. Now, this is just UI validation. It's not going to like stop us from submitting the form or anything, but let's say this email address right here, which is this input, it has to be an email address, and it's going to go off of the HTML5 validation because we have type email. So what we can do is we can add, actually, first of all, we need to add our input field class, or this won't work, right? And then we're going to add a class to the input of validate. Now, just having that, if I were to put something in here that's not an email address and click out, you'll see that the line turns red. Now, if we want a message, what we can do is where the label is, we can say data dash error equals, and let's just say invalid, and then we can say data dash success equals valid. So we'll save that, and now if I click and I put something that's not valid and click outside, we get the text invalid. If I put something that is a valid email address and then click outside, we get valid. So we do have some UI validation we can do without even having to touch JavaScript or anything like that. All right, so that is pretty nice. Next, we're going to look at select lists. Okay, now what I'm going to do here is we just have a div. Let's give it the class of input field, and let's give this select some options. So we'll say option. Actually, we'll just add, let's say, option ×4 tab. And for this one, it's going to be disabled because it's just like the kind of like the title. We're going to make it selected by default, and it's just going to say select option. Okay. And then for the options, we'll just say 1. Doesn't really matter. Option 1, 2, 3. Option 2 and option 3. Okay, and then if I save this, notice that we can't see it. We don't see any select list. That's because with Materialize, when you use a select list, you actually have to initialize it in the JavaScript, okay, with jQuery. So we need to go to the bottom down here where it says JavaScript start here. Okay, notice we're already in the document.ready for jQuery. This obviously is just for the drop down for our menu right here. This is on every page. But what we want to do is we want to initialize the select list. And we do that by using jQuery and just taking the select that's on the page, and we're going to call .material _ select, like that. So I'm going to call that special function, and now we can see it, and if I click it, we get the drop down. Okay, so we need to add that in order to initialize this. And it also initializes these other selects that we have, which we actually don't have any options for yet. So the next one I want to show is option groups. So what I'll do is actually just copy the select list we just put in, and let's change this to multiple select list just so we know what it is. Actually, no, this isn't a multiple select. This is option groups. Option group select, and what we want is just different groups of options. So let's take right here, let's go right here, and let's say, actually, you know what, let's get rid of this, and then let's do opt group, like that. Should give us a tag. I guess Emmet isn't going to work with that, so it should be opt group, and then we're going to give it a label of, let's say, option group 1, and then we want to wrap a certain set of options, so we'll just take 1 and 2 and wrap that. Okay, and then let's actually just copy this whole thing, paste it there. This will be group 2, and then this will be 3 and 4, like that. So let's save, and now if I were to click this, we have option group 1, we have 2 options, option group 2. Okay, so you can kind of separate your options into groups. Next thing we'll look at is multiple select. So what I'm going to do is copy the regular select we have and just paste that in there. And then all we have to do to make this a multiple select is just add on right here multiple. Not class multiple, but just a multiple attribute. And now we can go ahead and select different options. It's kind of like a radio box inside of your select list. All right. So, and speaking of radio buttons, let's do those next. So we're just going to go ahead and put in, oops. We're going to put in some paragraph tags, and in each one I want an input, and this is going to have a type of radio. Okay, so we don't need a name. Actually, we'll just keep the name. So we'll say this is for gender. Since it's an input radio, we should have a name. ID, we'll say male, and let's put a label. We'll say label for, actually, so label for whatever the ID is, which we'll say male, not M-A-I-L. And we'll go like that. All right, so there we have one radio button. Now I'll just copy this, and this one will be female. And we'll save that, and there we go. So we have our radio buttons. If we wanted one to be checked by default, obviously we could just put a checked attribute. That's just standard HTML. Another thing we can do is we can change how the fill looks. See how it takes the whole thing up? If we want, we can add to the radio input a class of width-gap and save. And now if I check this one, see how that looks different? It has the gap around it. So we can change how that looks as well. All right, so next we're going to look at checkboxes. So very similar, we're going to put in our paragraphs, and let's say input. Type is going to be a checkbox, and let's see, let's say ID HTML. We'll go ahead and just put some languages in here, or technologies. For name, we'll just say tech, and let's put a label, and we'll say for HTML. And save. Now we have a little checkbox, and it has that cool animation by default. So let's copy this paragraph, and I want to put a couple more. I'll put 3 more. And then this one, let's make this CSS. And for this one, I'm going to just make this one checked by default. Just kind of giving you a couple different examples, see how that's checked. And then for this one, let's call it JS. And what I'm going to do is give this one a class of filled-in and save. And now this one, it has a different effect. You see how it doesn't flip like the default. It just kind of, it fills the whole thing in dark, and it doesn't do the little flip. And then for the last one here, we'll make this PHP. And what I want to do is disable this one. So I'm just going to put in disabled and save. And now you'll see that checkbox is disabled. So just a couple different options that you can do with your checkboxes. All right, so those are the basic form elements. Next, we're going to get into more fancy things like sliders and ranges and things like that. We'll also be working with JavaScript a little bit.